The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 2, Dragon and Soldier. Chapter 13.
Quickly, Jack got his hand down off the railing and stiffened to attention. "I was moving these civilians out of danger, sir," he explained, giving a short nod toward the parapet still huddled on the floor beside him. "They were caught in the fire zone."
"Very commendable,"
Grisco said tartly. If he was pleased with Jack's answer, it didn't show on his face.
"Anyone give you any actual orders to that effect, or did you dream it up all on your own?"
"And then decide to hide in here with them?" Johnny muttered.
"Shut up, Randolph,"
Grisco snapped, his eyes never leaving Jack's face.
"Someone give you orders, Montana? Anyone give you orders, Montana?"
"Not exactly, sir," Jack admitted, feeling a fresh batch of sweat breaking out on his forehead. This was just great. He'd survived an enemy attack, and now he was going to catch it from his own side? And possibly catch it even worse than just being shot at. The manual had listed some pretty severe penalties for desertion under fire. "There wasn't anyone nearby to give me any orders," he went on, trying desperately to think his way out of this.
"The manual lists 12 standing orders for behavior in a firefight,"
Grisco ground out.
"You remember any of them being to turn tail and run like a rabbit?"
Jack clamped down on his anger and his tongue. "No, sir," he conceded. Beside him, one of the parapets whimpered. And at last, inspiration. "But I do remember that an edgeman's primary job is service to our employer," he continued more confidently. "Since our employer on Sunrise is a parapet group, I assume all local parapets come under that heading."
"Nice try,"
Grisco said.
"Problem is, the protection of civilians comes 3 points below support of your comrades on the list."
Beside him, Allison stirred. "I wonder where his gun is," she murmured. Grisco frowned, his eyes flicking to Jack's shoulder and then glancing at the floor and tables around him.
"That's a good question. You got a good answer?"
Jack would have smiled with relief if he'd dared. Of course, the escape hatch he'd been trying to find. "One of the other edgemen took it, sir," he said. A slight frown creased Grisco's forehead.
"Why?"
"I believe he wanted to use it against the snipers up on the hillside," Jack explained. "All he was carrying was a Heckler Colt MP50, not really suitable for long-range work."
"So why didn't he give you his HC?"
Grisco demanded. "I didn't have time to ask him, sir," Jack said. "He just took my gompers and ran with it. To be honest," he added with what he hoped was just the right touch of humility, "I don't think the regulars think very much of us as combat soldiers." Grisco's lip twist.
"I can't really say I blame them."
He looked at the parapets, back at Jack.
"All right, get outside,"
he growled.
"We're forming up. Go get your gompers back and get your carcass into position."
He turned sharply and stalked outside. Johnny gave Jack a dark look, then strode out behind him. "I guess we don't get to see a court-martial after all," Allison remarked. "Too bad. Might have been interesting." "Sorry to disappoint you," Jack said, waving a farewell to the parapets and heading toward the door. "At least you got to watch me squirm. Was that enough entertainment for one afternoon?" She lifted her eyebrows. "Hey, I got you off the hook. What more do you want?" "You could have mentioned a little earlier you saw that thug ugly take my gun," Jack pointed out stiffly. "Yes, I could have said something earlier," Allison agreed. "But why should I?" "Maybe because Grisco was getting himself worked up into a real froth about this," Jack suggested as he stepped up to her. "By the time you actually spoke up, there was half a chance he wouldn't even have cared anymore that I hadn't had a gun. He would have been ready to nail me to the wall right there. Ever think of that?" "Sure," she agreed. "And maybe if I had said something right off the top, he'd have thought I was just covering for a deserter. Then we'd both have been in for the hot seat. Ever think of that?" Jack frowned, his annoyance fading a little as he gazed into her eyes. There was something odd there, simmering beneath the surface like a churning of molten rock. Anger and frustration and determination, and perhaps more than a little fear. A lot like the way he'd been feeling lately himself. For about the last year, in fact, ever since Uncle Virgil had died. I thought we were comrades in arms, he said quietly. She regarded him coolly. I don't stick my neck out for you, Montana, she said just as quietly. You or anyone else. Turning, she walked out the door. Okay, Jack muttered aloud to himself. Good to have that settled.
An interesting person,
Dracos murmured from his shoulder. Oh, yeah, Jack said sourly. Interesting like a rare and delicate tropical disease. Come on, let's go find the clown who's got my gun. It took several minutes for Jack to track down the man who'd taken his flash rifle. It took several more to actually get the weapon back. Still eyeing the hillside suspiciously, the soldier was clearly not interested in giving up his long-range firing capability, and told Jack so in language that would have made Grisco proud. But by then, the officers were starting to call the troops back into formation, and Jack's mention of Grisco's name also seemed to carry a certain amount of weight. Eventually, with one last muttered curse, the soldier shoved the gompers back into Jack's hands and stomped back to rejoin the column. At Dracos' advice, Jack replaced the half-used clip with a fresh one, then hurried back to his own place in line. A few minutes later, the whole group resumed their march through town, but not with nearly the brash confidence they'd shown earlier. Now they marched with their attention turned upward, toward the windows and rooftops as they passed beneath them. Their weapons were again slung over their shoulders, but it seemed to Jack that none of them let his or her hand get too far from the trigger. And, of course, the combat aircraft floating watchfully overhead were a continual reminder of what had just happened. The Wynyard's Edge had gotten its nose bloodied today. There was a change in the townspeople, too. Not surprisingly, the crowds that had been lining the street earlier were gone. Those who found themselves near the marching soldiers seemed intent on hurrying to be somewhere else. Earlier, the people had seemed nervous and uncertain. Now they were flat out afraid. Mentally, Jack shook his head. Whatever result the Edge commanders had hoped for with this stroll through the city, he was pretty sure that wasn't it. They reached the headquarters compound without any further trouble. A pair of carriers loaded with their equipment rumbled in behind them, and there was a sort of confused chaos as footlockers and other gear were sorted out. Back on Carrion, Jack had gotten the impression that his squad would be staying in Merseb for a few days before moving up to November 6 observation post. But barely an hour after their arrival, the order came down for 8 of the new squads to assemble immediately for transport to their field destinations. Tango 5 Zulu was one of them. They boarded their transport, a Lynx personnel carrier, in the courtyard of the HQ compound. Along with Tango 5 Zulu, 2 squads of regular Edgemen would also be traveling to November 6. Sergeant Grisco was along too, at least long enough to help them set up. The Lynx was a good-sized transport, designed to haul at least 3 times the number of people they had on this trip. That meant some elbow room for a change, and Jack took quick advantage of the situation by staking out a pair of seats in the back next to one of the small windows. Setting his pack down on one of the seats, he strapped himself into the other. If he kept his eyes glued to the scenery, maybe he could pretend he was heading out on some sort of vacation. On a vacation, and not into a war zone. It turned out to be a futile hope. Unlike the other Edge transports Jack had traveled on so far, the Lynx actually looked like a military vehicle. Intruding constantly on his view of the landscape were the muzzles of 2 large-caliber machine guns poking out from under one of the stubby wings. The wing itself was painted in a camouflage pattern designed to help it blend in while on the ground. The landscape itself wasn't all that exciting either. The hilly ground around Merseb soon gave way to a short stretch of plains and small lakes, then began to turn hilly again. Grisco had said the trip to November 6 would take 2 hours, and Jack found himself wondering just how big the territory was that this battlefield that this handful of Edgemen was supposed to be protecting. With such cheery thoughts dancing around his brain, he huddled over with his forehead against the cold plastic of the window and drifted to sleep. He awoke suddenly, startled by a light jab on his wrist. He snapped his eyes open and looked around. No one was leaning intently over him. For that matter, no one was paying any attention to him at all. The nearest other person, Rogan Mabusu, was sprawled limply 2 seats over, snoring quietly to himself. Outside the window, the afternoon sunlight was throwing long shadows across the ground. The light jab came again, and this time Jack recognized it as the touch of a dragon's claw. the signal of a dragon's nagging. What? He muttered toward his shoulder.
I must speak with you,
Dracos murmured back.
Now? Now!
Jack glared down at his shoulder, a wasted effort with his shirt and jacket mostly in the way. Dracos had a real gift for rotten timing. But there was nothing to do but go along. Unstrapping, he headed past the equipment storage area to one of the tiny restrooms in the far rear of the transport. He closed the door, sealed it, and did a quick check for monitors. There weren't any. "This had better be good," he warned as he closed the toilet lid and sat down. With the usual sudden surge of weight, Dracos popped out of Jack's collar. He landed on the area around the sink and turned around, balancing himself there with apparent ease.
"It is important,"
he promised.
"Do you remember the map we were shown of the area around November 6th?
Jack growled. "You woke me from a good nap for this? A geography quiz?"
"Please,"
Draco said earnestly.
"The Gray Hills flow from the northeast to southwest, with Bear Mountain to the north of the base. Correct?"
"Right," Jack said. "Then the Gray Hills continue down toward the Octarny Lake, with the Partaran River flowing out mostly west from there."
"While a tributary of that same river is the water that flows through Merseb,"
Draco said.
"The Parapan town we have just left, correct?"
"Sounds right," Jack confirmed, stifling a yawn. "So what?"
"So this,"
Draco said.
"the place we were shown on the map is not the place we are going."